Namaste, welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Vineet Chander and I serve as an assistant dean in the Office of Religious Life, where I oversee our Hindu Life program. The Hindu Life program is honored to sponsor this evening's event. I also want to acknowledge with gratitude the support given by the Religion Department as well as the Humanities Council, and of course our dear friends from Labyrinth Books who are present and have copies of the two books that our speakers will be drawing from this evening. Please do stay afterwards and get your books, and if you like, and we have time, perhaps to have our esteemed authors sign the books if you'd like. Before I introduce our wonderful special guests, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes because of the unusual times that we're living in. So as you notice, I am not wearing my mask right now, and that is because of the role that I'm playing right now at the podium, but I will be wearing my mask after that. Our speakers also have been cleared not to wear their masks during the conversation, and of course we've arranged things in a nice way to keep everyone safe and comfortable with appropriate distancing. However, in accordance with university policy, we do ask that everyone participating or attending this evening, that you all remain masked at all times. Our restrooms are available just outside of those doors. Please do keep in mind that the doors do require procs for entry. And of course, we are live streaming this event for folks who are not able to join us. We are live streaming on YouTube, and the recording will live there on the Hindu Life Program YouTube channel. I don't want to take away too much time from our speakers or to steal their thunder, as it were, so I'll try to keep my introductions necessarily brief. First, we're so grateful and honored to have with us Sadhvi Bhagavati Saraswati. Sadhvi ji, as she is affectionately known, is a renowned spiritual leader and motivational speaker based in Rishikesh, India. At Paramarth Niketan, where she lives most of the year, she gives daily spiritual discourses or satsang, teaches meditation, provides spiritual counseling and mentoring, and engages in her own deep spiritual practice or sadhana. Sadhviji earned her PhD in psychology from Stanford University. While still a graduate student, she left America and traveled to India, where her journey brought her to live at Paramarth Niketan. Eventually, she was officially initiated into the order of sannyas, or monastic renunciation, by His Holiness Swami Chidanand Saraswati ji. She recounts this journey in vivid detail in her newly published memoir, Hollywood to the Himalayas, A Journey of Healing and Transformation, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it this evening. In addition to that volume, Sadhviji is the author of 4 previous books on spirituality and is also well known as an activist. She serves on several committees within the United Nations and World Bank and is well known for her commitment to the intersection of environmentalism and spirituality. Sadhviji is joined in conversation this evening by Princeton University's very own Dr. Elaine Pagels, a historian of religion. Elaine is the Harrington Spear Paine Professor at Princeton University and an Aspen Institute trustee. She earned undergraduate and master's degrees from Stanford, so already a connection with Sadhviji, and her doctorate from Harvard. She joined the Princeton faculty in 1982, shortly after receiving a MacArthur Fellowship. Along with the MacArthur, she has been the recipient of several awards for her scholarship, including an honorary law degree from her alma mater, Harvard, in 2013, and the National Medal for the Arts from President Barack Obama in 2016. A prolific author, Professor Pagels is perhaps best known as the author of the Gnostic Gospels, The Origin of Satan, and Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas. She has published widely on Gnosticism and early Christianity and continues to pursue research interests on topics that include sexuality and politics, visions, and the origins of Christian anti-Semitism. Tonight, however, she will draw from her most recent book, in some ways a striking departure from the others, given its very personal nature. Called Why Religion? A Personal Story, it poignantly narrates her journey and why she loves investigating religion, the history of religion, and why we believe. Let us give both of our esteemed speakers a very warm Princeton University welcome. So I'm going to play the role of moderator for this evening's conversation, and I've prepared a couple of questions in advance based on my own reading of these two really amazing volumes. But we're also going to hold this space lightly and see where the conversation takes us. So the first question that I'd like to put to our speakers to get our conversation going really derives from the imagery of the spiritual journey that we've used as a framing device for this conversation. And the question is this: why undertake a spiritual journey in the first place? What is the point? In a world where there seems to be so much to take our attention and to engage us right here in the here and now, why a spiritual journey to begin with? Elaine, would you start us off?
Well, I don't think I started out for a spiritual journey, but it happens. It happens because in your book also, you wrote about living in a two-dimensional world instead of three. Both of us, I believe, grew up in households that were essentially secular. My family was Christian in background, but my parents had no real use for it. I thought it was quite fascinating, but was much more captivated by poetry and music and dance. But there was a time I wrote about this, just one afternoon in Palo Alto. You know how boring a town it is. It really was a boring place to grow up. And I was invited to go to San Francisco. I didn't care what it was for. Anything going on in San Francisco would be more interesting than Palo Alto on a Sunday afternoon. But my friends had invited me, I was in 14, to a Billy Graham crusade. I didn't know who Billy Graham was. But there were thousands of people in the place where everybody would see baseball games, the Cow Palace. Was it the Cow Palace or Candlestick Park? Anyway, it was a massive venue. And this preacher was speaking. He was speaking criticisms about the world I grew up in. He said what he said would sound weird to academics, and it did. He was condemning America, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and saying that scientists had done this and they're trying to build bigger weapons. I never thought of that, because in my household, my father was a scientist. Science was the greatest of all wisdom. And then he spoke about segregation and slavery in the South. And then he talked about being born again. You could be born again and start all over. And I thought, that's perfect. I'm 14. I want my own life. So I would just, but it was very powerful music, and it was powerful speaking. And so I absolutely went up and was born again. And it was a powerful experience. I don't know what I expected, but it made me aware of a much deeper dimension of human life than the one in which my family was accustomed to live. And even though I had to leave it a year later, I left that group because they said that a friend of mine who was killed in an accident they asked if he was born again, my Christian friends, supposedly. And I said, no, he was Jewish. And they said, well, then he's in hell. And I felt like I had been smacked and walked out of there and never went back. I thought, this is nothing about what you were talking about, the love of God. And that made some sense to me, and it was powerful. And so I left it all behind. But years later, I thought, something about that experience was powerful. It opened up a world of imagination in which you live in a very different kind of dimension. And I wanted to find out what it was. So that's what I started to do. That was a start.
So I was about 10 years behind in coming onto a spiritual path. I was 25. And, you know, Vinitji, as you ask about going on a spiritual journey, I had no idea I was on a spiritual journey. I was a graduate student with a backpack who agreed to go to India because I loved vegetarian, I was a strict vegetarian and I loved Indian food. And so when India was suggested, when my husband said, I want to go to India, immediately what came in my mind was, okay, well at least I like the food. Which is of course quite embarrassing 25 years later. You know, when you tell the story, my ego would love to say that, oh yes, I was acutely aware of the shallowness of the world of material possessions, and I was aware of the shallowness of the values, and I prayed to God to show me something else. My ego would love to tell the story that way. It just doesn't have any bearing in the truth. The truth was, I was an academic. I was a scientist. I had been raised in, for all practical purposes, as you say, a secular family. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish family. But religion was always about the community and the culture. So we went to synagogue because it mattered to my grandmother. I was bat mitzvah to make my grandparents happy. The holidays that we celebrated were holidays that signified the stories of the Jewish people and the ancestors. It was never about God. It was never about a connection to God. It was about our people, our ancestors, your grandmother. And of course, that absence of the experience of the divine in my life was not something that I had any awareness of. I didn't know I was missing something. There was not a moment of my life dedicated to how can I go on a spiritual journey, or why would I go on a spiritual journey. The equation that in this world we're really given for happiness and for success is have a good education, get a good job, make a lot of money, have a nice house in the right area of town, vacation at the right resorts, look the right way. And I had those things. Now, I also had experienced really deep trauma in my early childhood, deep suffering, and I carried that with me into my adolescence, into my early 20s, as just something that was kind of a part of my life. It never occurred to me this was something I could become free of. The eating disorder, the addictions that followed that were the best way that I, as a young person, not on a spiritual journey, knew to take care of the pain I experienced was through addiction, through getting out of the pain of the present moment into an experience of being numbed, as we know chemically. But I never realized there might be another alternative, that actually there might be the possibility of freedom, of joy, of ecstasy, of peace, of divine connection. And so when I landed up in India with a backpack, thinking I was just going to be able to eat nice vegetarian food and make my husband happy for having agreed to come, I had this extraordinary spiritual awakening experience of oneness. I mean, there's no semantics that work for it. We just go around it. But an experience of the perfection of the universe and the awareness that I was part of that. And that I was not dark or dirty or wrong or bad or unworthy or not good enough or not whole enough, as I always had felt. But that actually, oh my God, the universe is so incredible, and oh my God, I'm part of it. And I mean, for such a long time, all I could say was, oh my God, it's so beautiful. Oh my God, it's so beautiful, with tears streaming down my eyes. So I was taken on a spiritual journey, unbeknownst to myself, sort of a ticket that I had no idea where it was going to go. And we'll talk more about it, but just lastly, I wanted to comment on your point about when we've got so much keeping us in the here and now, why we would want to go on a spiritual journey. And what I would say to you about that is, without spirituality, and by the way, the journey part, whether it's a journey into San Francisco or a journey to Rishikesh, India, you don't need to go on a physical journey. So a spiritual journey doesn't mean, okay, where am I going to go for my experience of connection and awakening? But without spirituality, without an internal journey of the spirit, you actually, I think, would have a very difficult time being in the here and now. Because otherwise our mind is constantly taking us into the past and into the future. It's constantly in stress, it's constantly in grudges, it's constantly in the anxiety of what's going to happen, the yearning for what we've lost, or the memory, the sweet memory, or the pain of what the past was. That's where the spiritual traditions are actually the ones that say, be mindful. Be aware, be here now with the practices of meditation. So you're right, we should be in the here and now. But my insatiable yearning for department stores or cheeseburgers or anything in between isn't really a product of the here and now, the real here and now. It's more a product of my reaction to my past, to my future, to the workings in my own brain, to the commercial I saw, to the billboard, to what everyone around me is doing. So spirituality actually gives us that experience of the perfection of the here and now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm going to jump around in my notes a little bit because I'm struck, Sadhviji, in your sharing both this evening and in the book of the pain that you were carrying. And Elaine, I was similarly struck with the raw honesty and vulnerability with which you wrote about your experience with tragedy, with loss, with pain.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we factor in the tragedy, the setbacks, the loss, what, Elaine, you so powerfully call wrestling with the devil? Where do we factor that into the spiritual life, to the spiritual walk?
Well, I felt, and I saw this in your work too, what you wrote about your family background. In my family, people didn't talk about what was really going on. I thought all the most interesting topics were kind of, were not discussed. And I'm thinking of politics, religion, sex, money, and there's another one I'm forgetting, I forget. But death. And there was no way to deal with some of the realities that were going on. And there was a lot of attempt to ignore what was uncomfortable, and particularly death. I mean, they didn't have a language for it. They didn't have a ritual for it. I envied people who did, but I didn't know anything about it except that it was a terribly desolating experience, and there was no way to engage it. And I had to engage it. First of all, when my high school friend was suddenly killed, that was very shocking for all the people who shared that experience. And then later in my life, when unexpected things happened, I had a wonderful family, a husband that I adored and was very lucky to be married to. And we had a child that we loved very much. And our child died of a lung disease at the age of 6.5. Very rare thing. Nobody knew what it was. And about a year later, my wonderful husband, we adopted 2 children because we thought we couldn't live without children, having had lost a child. I don't like the word lost. It's such a euphemism. You know, you think you don't lose your child in a supermarket. The child died. You know, that's a very different kind of thing, and very hard to fathom. So we adopted 2 children, and then my husband suddenly was killed in a hiking accident a year later, and I had two babies and was totally devastated. And so I didn't have a language, a way, emotionally, spiritually, to deal with those losses. And that's what I struggle with, but my work, what I was doing with my research, I was trying to understand why religion, why people need it, why I had some powerful experience I didn't expect, as you did. And nobody told me that's what it was. I thought it was believing in a bunch of things. And I'm not even interested now in what I believe, because that's pretty superficial compared to certain kinds of experience that you talk about as well. So the work became a path, and luckily I came upon some amazing sources that opened that world, and made it possible to not only engage what happened, but to just live with it and go on living with joy. I didn't know that could happen.
I have not. By great grace, great fortune or luck, or however we think about it, had to experience that level of tragedy. That level of, not as you say so beautifully, loss of the child like you lost him in the supermarket, but lost as in a limb was gone, or rather all of the limbs were gone, or rather the heart was gone. I couldn't even begin to imagine that level of tragedy. Your courage and eloquence in sharing that and guiding others through it, I know, has been of such deep importance for so many people. As these sorts of tragedies happen, and happen all too frequently in so many ways. For me, the pain that I experienced was more deliberate, you could say, as in done by a human being who in theory had alternate options to me. And so I had been very severely sexually abused in childhood. I had then been abandoned, not abandoned on a street corner, but abandoned as in my biological father, who had also been the abuser, when I was 8, told me he never wanted to see me again. And there was a great deal of trauma that, as I mentioned earlier, led me into ways of dealing that were neither efficient nor effective, but nonetheless what so many of us find ourselves in when we experience pain. Some substance to just numb it, to take us out of that pain of the moment. What I experienced when I went to India, by the time I went there at 25, I had been in a lot of therapy. I had done a lot of work around the abuse, around the eating disorder. And by the time I got to India, I really felt like I had learned to manage it, that I really had things under control. I was a graduate student. I was taking 21 units a quarter. I was getting straight A's. I felt like, yeah, I've got this life under control. I was doing much better with regard to the eating disorder, with regard to the pain. It, of course, bubbled out in a variety of ways. My husband would go off to work and I would throw a temper tantrum as though he were the father leaving to never return. But aside from some kind of interesting psychological ramifications of it, if you looked at me, or if you met me, or we interacted, you would have thought, this girl's got everything all together. Like, she's really in good shape. And yet, I was still suffering so much on the inside because I felt so much the recipient of that pain that it made me feel that there was something wrong with me. And so when you speak about tragedy, as someone to whom that had happened as a young, impressionable child, my mind said it must be my fault. And so it wasn't just a tragedy of the universe, but rather I must have done something to deserve that. There must be something in me, of me, that is dark, that is wrong, that... And when I went to India and was given this incredible teaching by my guru, I mean, he wasn't my guru at the time, I had just met him, but this incredible spiritual master in India, one of the most revered leaders in India, in front of whom I just by grace ended up because literally I had chosen a hotel next to the ashram and had heard a voice, me the non-mystic, me the academic, had heard a voice saying, you must stay here. And I had then gotten my feet literally glued to the ground of the ashram. And when I found myself in front of him and he said, I want you to give your pain to the river. It was amazing. I used to keep a journal. And I've got journal entries from that day that say, just give it to the river as though it were simply an apple core. And yet, I committed to do it. I knew it wasn't going to work. I knew there was no way that rivers just take people's pain. I knew there was no way I was going to be able to give it, but nonetheless, out of respect and sincerity, in the presence of the being who had told me to do this, I walked into that river. And I stood there for God knows how long until I could pull from within me all of the anger and all of the pain and all of the trauma from within me and literally offer it into the water. And until through tears pouring down my eyes, until I could say, I forgive you. And it was nothing short of grace. And it's been the most extraordinary blessing to be able to do that, because that was what made me free. And, you know, going back for a moment, Vinitji, to the question that you asked about the role of tragedy, the slightly more philosophical aspect of your question, in addition to the narrative. In these last 25 years of living in India, while by God's grace I haven't experienced abuse or this level of tragedy, our world is in a state of tragedy. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the news and there's tragedy. And what I've thought so much about, the core scripture within the Hindu tradition is the Bhagavad Gita. And when I say core, meaning kind of the quintessential, sort of the distilled essence of the Vedas is said to be the Bhagavad Gita. And it's 700 short, I mean, you could read it in an hour and a half, 2 hours. And what I love about it is, it takes place on a battlefield. It is spoken to a man who is standing in between members of his family on both sides of the battle, and is being called upon through his dharma to engage in battle, where there's going to be death. And he says at the very beginning to Krishna, who's the embodiment of the divine and who happens to be the driver of his chariot in the battle, he says, forget it, I'm not going to do this. I could die. And Krishna doesn't say to him, now he's God, remember, he's omniscient, he knows what's going to happen, but he doesn't say to Arjun, don't worry. You're not going to die, you're going to win. Great tragedy is going to happen. You're going to lose your family. But you will not die. He doesn't say that. He says, yeah, you might. You might. But to die in the fulfillment of your purpose in life is 1,000,000 times better than to live forever and not fulfill that purpose. And when I think about that, and I think about the war, and I think about the tragedy in the world, I realize there's no scripture that I know of, and I'm certainly not a religious scholar, but there's no scripture that I know of in any religion that says, come to me, and you will never die, you will never get sick, no one you love will ever die, no one you love will ever get sick. we're not promised that. Tragedy is an inherent part. And I think when you think about all of the scriptures and the tragedy that the stories of our scriptures are woven around, it seems like, well, of course, we're given these stories to remind us. I mean, in Hinduism, our two epics of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they're both tragedies. Tragedies on so many levels. I won't go into it now, but they're incredible tragedies of the heroes who are the embodiment of the divine. And so it's basically to me saying, even when you come onto earth, as God incarnated, nonetheless, people are going to try to kill you. You're going to get sent off into the jungles. You're going to have such a difficult life. You're going to come face to face with so much tragedy. And so I think on a very core level, on that philosophical level, we're supposed to know that this is part of life. As absolutely horrendous and unthinkable as it is when it happens.
It's a very different kind of story than the ones that I'm thinking about in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But I thought, what is it about that experience that I had that opened up the world? You know, I mean, you talked at one point about a children's story about the Wizard of Oz. It was one of my favorites. And when I was reading it, The Wizard of Oz, read all those books, I was Dorothy, you know. I was going out into Oz with the little dog Toto and, you know, the Wicked Witch, Glinda the Good, the wizard who's a fake, all of it made total sense to me, the Cowardly Lion. It was a canvas on which I could live when I was, I don't know, 7 or 8. And that experience of believing in a world or imagining a world in which God and Satan and Jesus, and there's this huge cosmological drama going on in the world and you're part of it. I thought, what is it about that was so powerful? So I went back to graduate school to try to find out, what do we know about Jesus and who started this religion anyway and why? And then something I didn't expect happened. My professors had file cabinets full of gospels I'd never heard of. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And these were buried and destroyed by leaders of the church in the 2nd to 4th century. And they were called heresy, which means, by the way, choice, which is something bishops didn't think was too good for people, to have a choice. But these texts are so different from what I knew as Orthodox Christianity, Jesus died for your sins, all of that. In the Gospel of Thomas, there was a line. Jesus says, and I was totally riveted by the line. It said, it's supposed to be secret teaching of Jesus. And it may be. We don't know. Jesus says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you.
Wow.
Yeah, and I said, oh.
Wow.
You know, you don't have to believe that. It just happens to be true, right? And there were other sayings like that, which you know from your tradition. Jesus says, to see what is before you, and the mysteries will be revealed to you. It's a teaching, a mystical teaching. Maybe mystical Judaism is the source of it, but it's also the disciple who went to India, Thomas. tradition says he went to India. And I don't think Jesus went to India. I mean, for a village rabbi, that's really quite a stretch. But people did go back and forth. And that teaching probably did go to India. And I wonder if it didn't come back infused with some of the teaching of the Vedas and of Buddhist teachings. Or maybe not, because you can find something very similar in Jewish mystical thought 1,000 years later in Kabbalah. But it's not about belief, it's about experience on some other level. And that's what I find matters about religious experience, not what you believe in or don't.
Can I pick up there? Just I'm really intrigued by this idea of what seems like a kind of an inherent resonance between what we commonly call the mystics of different faith traditions, sometimes separated by great spans of geography, of time, and yet there seems to be this kind of these echoes again and again. Both of you have written about and have spoken about, and if I may say in my own reading, it seems like you're both really kind of drawn to those mystic, the voices of the mystics. Could we speak about that a little bit? What is it about the message of the mystics that sometimes can seem so resonant with one another and so dissonant with other members of one's own tradition?
Well, so much of religious traditions are about specific cultures, languages, customs, sense of what's correct to do or not to do, whatever, in that particular culture. These esoteric traditions, I think, come out of some kinds of human experience that we recognize cross-culturally. And of course, in different languages, just as we speak different languages. It comes out sounding different. I was teaching a class with our colleague, Jonathan Gold, who's a specialist on Tibetan Buddhism. And we called it Jesus and Buddha. And there's everything that's so different about those traditions. Cosmology, the sense of a lifetime, the sense of time span, almost everything you can think of is culturally so different. But when it comes to the heart of the teachings about how you must act toward other people and toward yourself, there's a deep similarity. And I just think that's because it happens to be true.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that people of different colors, people speaking different languages, sitting in different corners of the earth, separated by many years, but going within and connecting to that inner truth, would find that it's the same. So I love the idea that Jesus came to India, just because it's a beautiful, fun idea.
It is.
And
Why not?
it sounds really nice. I mean, the idea of him traveling and also occupying space in India feels very united in many ways. And yet, whether he came physically or whether he and so many of the other bestowers of divine wisdom bestowed wisdom that is in different languages and wrapped up in different cultural practices, but that ultimately is saying the same thing, that doesn't surprise me. As you say, it's the truth. So in the same way that scientists in different parts of the world find that they discover similar things because it's true, it doesn't surprise me that spiritual scientists are discovering the same truths. When I think of mystics, I think of kind of the intractable lovers in the religious traditions. The ones who cannot be bound up by dogma, by rules. The ones who are just in rapture, in love. And that some of them love by song, and some of them love in poetry, and some of them love, just different ways. Some of them hand us prayers and others hand us songs. But they're, in my mind, the ones who come automatically to me, the ones whose writings or songs or poetry I have had the blessing of drinking, are lovers of God. And they're lovers of God in the way that, as so many of us have experienced in our life, when we fall in love, sometimes it doesn't obey the rules of the household. Sometimes it doesn't obey the rules of our culture. And yet that doesn't stop love. And I think about the mystics as these just lovers of God in a way where it doesn't fit the current conventional rules, but that's okay with them. And if it means they're going to live out in the forest, if it means they're going to be wandering, if it means they're going to, so be it. Because that love is what sustains them. Mm-hmm. And that love is what they bring forth from them, which saves them. And I think they're all, I would imagine, deeply aware that if they didn't bring forth that love, it would kill them. And so even if they find themselves literally beheaded, at least they are being beheaded alive, rather than able to live in the body but dead to themselves. Yes. So I love the mystical traditions because it's this opportunity to love God in different names and different forms and different ways by beings who experienced that love through different paths, but all of them are just immersed in it, dripping wet in the ocean of love.
And what I think the institutions are worried about.
Yes.
And
Renegades.
the churches that banned these secret gospels, which they speak about the connection, an intuitive connection that every person here has with the divine source from which we come. And that if you find that connection, if you find that energy, whatever it is, you can find your way back to that source. That's the teaching about it. That the discontinuity between humans and the divine, which is so deeply part of Orthodox religion, and of course much Western religion particularly, is not part of these traditions. They speak about the connectedness. And it doesn't work for Orthodox churches because I think the Gospels of the New Testament, which are quite powerful as writings, all suggest that Jesus is the most important person in the universe that ever was. And if you're not saved through Jesus, as I was told in this evangelical church when my friend wasn't born again, I mean, you're lost, right? So you need that institution. That's the path. And what I found is, for me, was a deeper path, is some of these sources that were rejected by institutional Christianity. Although there are elements of institutional Christianity, the music, you talk about the music of Mozart, the music of Palestrina or Bach, or, I mean, so much magnificent music, poems, liturgies, rituals. There's much to love in Orthodox institutions, if you like that sort of thing, and I do. But when it leaves out the heart of it, it suppresses the difficult and much more powerful way of living, which means going within, as you said. That's not easy. That's not easy. But it's much more interesting.
And it's, from what I've seen, it's the only way. It's the only way to actually experience that presence of the divine in your life. If you don't go within, if we stay on the level of form rather than content, then not only don't we have the opportunity to know God, but we don't have the opportunity to know ourselves. Because the form keeps changing. The form is so temporary. But to actually go within, and it's been, I know on my spiritual journey, and I imagine for you that, well, the spiritual journey where it meets the psychological, emotional journey,
yeah,
is a journey where you have to go within. You have to find that wholeness within, that fullness within, that isn't dependent upon the presence of the achievement, the accolade, the possession. Because otherwise you just spend your life building these identities around roles, around titles, around achievements, around relationships, around dramas. So, you're the academic or the doctor or the lawyer or so-and-so's wife or mother or the abuse survivor or the this or the that. And they're different roles that we play. But they keep changing, as we see in such tragedy. They change even when we don't want them to change. And the only thing that doesn't change is that inner world. And so, yeah, it is much more difficult. Mm-hmm. But it's been, I know for me, it's been such an exciting and exquisite journey. For me, still to this day, it's still a journey. It's not like a journey that began and had a middle and a climax and then it ended. It's still a journey. It's a journey of peeling back layers as I move through life, of saying, oh wow, okay, here's this. Mm-hmm. Here's another layer. Here's another way I've kept myself separate from God. Here's another aspect of form that I've been identified with and attached to, that has kept me from connecting as content to content, that has made me identify as just the physical form or the energetic form. and has kept me separate. And oh, here's another layer, let me peel that back. Let me go within even more deeply and peel that back and peel that back. And then I find I go on for a while, and then another life situation arises. And then I realize, okay, here's another layer that I haven't yet examined that's keeping me from living as consciousness, as soul, as spirit, as love, as truth, as divinity. And then you peel them back, and you peel them back, and you know, we think about an onion and the layers of an onion, and eventually you peel them back and you get to a space that, in a bit of an oversimplification, the Buddhists tend to refer to as nothingness, the Hindus tend to refer to as everythingness, but nonetheless, it's that space after all of the layers have been pulled back. Whether we speak about shunya or we speak about porn, the emptiness, the fullness, it's that space where there isn't those layers. But you only get there from going within, so yeah, it's a lot easier to focus outside, but if I had allowed myself to keep focusing outside, I wouldn't have what I've experienced today and have the beautiful opportunity of being here with you tonight. Like none of this would have happened.
Beautiful, thank you. As our conversation winds down, as it were, I want to ask both of you to reflect a little bit about or on an apparent tension. You both write eloquently, and you've spoken eloquently this evening on being touched by the universal, the transcendent, that which is beyond the superficial forms, beyond perhaps even denomination or sectarian affiliation. And yet at the end of the day, you each engage with that universal through the lens of the particular. You each locate yourselves, or at least it seems to us that you each locate yourselves within the particular. In fact, we've framed this evening's conversation using the language of the particular, right? We said Hindu and Christian perspectives. Mm-hmm. How do we understand and negotiate this apparent tension between this engagement with the universal and then perhaps a necessary location within the particular?
Well, we are located within the particular, you know, space and time, and culture, and every other way. So I don't think of that as much of a tension.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I also don't. It doesn't seem to be a tension. It seems to me that the particular is a path into the universal. That river of the divinity, the river of consciousness, the river of God, whatever semantic framework we use, can be accessed through what you could call the Hindu steps to the river, or the Christian steps to the river, or the Muslim steps to the river, or the Buddhist steps to the river. But ultimately, we're getting into a river. I mean, the experience of God that I have is not a Hindu God. It's just God. And okay, I may get there by chanting the Hanuman Chalisa, or I may get there by sitting in katha, or I may get there by performing arti, or by going into meditation, chanting a mantra in Sanskrit that comes from the Hindu scriptures that was given to me by a Hindu guru. But once I'm there, it's not a Hindu God. And so this was a a pathway that I was given. And it's interesting, just since here we are in a world of kind of comparative religions for a moment, one of the questions that people ask frequently is, well, what about your Judaism? Like, whatever happened to that? And for me, the adoption of a Hindu way of life, of Hindu teachings, of a Hindu spirituality, which of course, as you know very well, none of the Hindu scriptures even uses the word Hindu. We speak about Sanatan Dharma, that simply means an eternal way of life. It's not about a dogma, it's about a way of living. But when I arrived in India, I didn't have a Jewish experience of God. I had not experienced God. The closest I had come to experiencing God was in the mountains, in the trees. And I wouldn't have described it as that. It's only in retrospect I can look back and say, oh yeah. So when I had the experience of God, standing on the banks of a river worshipped by Hindus as the mother goddess, standing on the platform of a Hindu ashram, it didn't come in and kick out a Jewish version of God. It came into a space in me that had otherwise been empty.
Makes sense.
And it filled me up. It didn't push anything out. So it's been for me much more of an augmentation than any kind of a swapping or changing or pushing. And now, you know, if I'm back in LA, these days are the high holidays, and occasionally over the last 25 years, I've been in LA at that time and go to synagogue with my parents. Well, I can feel God in synagogue. It's not that my Hindu experience of God says, wait, this is a Jewish place and I'm gonna wait for you outside. I have that same experience of God, because it isn't a Hindu God or a Jewish God. It was just the Hindu, for some reason, you think of destiny or karma or whatever, my way into the river was down the steps of a Hindu ashram. But the river that I've entered is a universal river. I mean, do you feel like your personal experience of God, does it feel to you like a Christian God?
I don't know what that means. I was very struck by a book that's written by a colleague at Stanford, Tanya Luhrmann. I don't know if you know this book. Tanya's an anthropologist. Her background is Jewish. And she started studying a witch coven in London. And she started doing their practices. Then she studied evangelical Christians in California, because she has members of her family in that group. She's also studied a group in India and another in Africa. And she's saying, what are they looking for? Her book is called How God Becomes Real. And just now you were talking about all of the ritual practices that you do to create an openness, right, to something greater. And she says, God becomes real in various traditions by practices, by prayers, by patterns of meditation, by forms of worship, by all kinds of different practices, not by thinking. And you made this point in your book, and it's certainly true for me. It's not a conceptual matter at all. It's not a matter of believing in God or not believing in God or any of what usually passes for are you religious in Western traditions, which are based largely on Christian practice, when Christianity became a set of beliefs instead of a way. You were talking about a way, about things you do to open yourself to another kind of reality, or to other kinds of reality. And that's quite different. So they could be practices in many different cultures. They obviously are.
Salviji, Elaine, both of you, in your comments this evening and in your respective really remarkable, beautiful books, evoke the idea of grace. Mm-hmm. In closing, can you share how you've personally come to understand grace, both in terms of now looking back retrospectively on the journeys that have brought you to this day and this time, and perhaps if you're willing to share what grace means to you right now?
Start.
For me, grace has been everything. When I think about the actual story, the plot of the story, the Hollywood to the Himalayas, which is the name of my book, when I think of that literal story, the Hollywood to the Himalayas via Palo Alto, but nonetheless, the physical arc that brought me there, it feels like grace. There was nothing in me. You know, we think about things are either inspiration or perspiration. So either it's something that I've struggled to make happen, or it's something that we say, by God's grace, it happened. And I'm not saying the two can't overlap, of course, but just for the sake of discussion for a moment, we'll call it the perspiration and inspiration streams. And all of that which I had achieved in my life through perspiration, through hard work, got me a lot of achievements. But it didn't bring me an inner sense of freedom or awakening or joy or peace beyond just an enjoyable evening, an enjoyable event, you know, happiness that I had gotten an A on an exam, a nice vacation. And then to be carried, literally, to the Himalayas, a place I didn't even have any interest in going, but to be carried there. And then to be carried to the hotel that we stayed in, which at the time was the only hotel on the side of the river where the ashram that I now live in was. All the other hotels were on the other side. And of course, it was the only hotel that required us to carry our luggage across a 400, 500 yard swinging footbridge. And you think, well, logically, I would have simply told the driver to forget the hotel I had booked us at and to take us to a different hotel. But grace was, and I just knew that hotel, and yes, we've got to schlep everything across the river, but so be it. And then that grace to give me the experience that I had when I thought I was just going down to the river to put my feet in. I didn't go down saying, oh God, please give me an experience of the oneness of the universe. Oh God, show yourself to me. I was just hot and tired and wanted to stick my feet in the river and cool off. But grace took over. The voice that I heard, getting my feet stuck to the ground, I mean, the whole story for me has been a story of grace. Other than keeping my heart open and being deeply committed to truth, both in speech as well as in action, Other than those two things, those are kind of the only things that in retrospect I can say I did that. I get credit for that, like I kept my heart open. I committed to truth. I wasn't going to let myself off the hook. Beyond that, everything else happened only by grace. I get no credit for any other bit of this extraordinary experience. It was all grace. And to me, as these last 25 years have gone by, it's been just this constant flow of grace. When I first started speaking, and there's the chapter in the book about giving satsang, about speaking and realizing I don't have the words, I don't have the wisdom, I don't have the answer. And that the only way to do it is to get out of the way and let grace flow. And that's when the power comes. That's when the transformation for others comes. When we can just be that vehicle, that vessel for grace. And whether it's that, whether it's the humanitarian work, the on the ground schools and women's programs and healthcare programs and environmental programs and all of the actual work that we're doing. Yeah, we're putting in the perspiration, but if grace weren't there, it wouldn't happen. The miracles that happen, I mean, one right after the other. I don't know if we have time. Do we have, I'm not aware, do we have time for me to tell a quick story about that? Okay. So just to give you an example of what I mean by that. So December of 2004, the tsunami hit South India. And a lot of Asia, of course, but South India where we live in the north, but our country. So it hit South India. We go down to South India having no idea of the level of destruction that has happened. We go down with overnight bags, planning to stay for 2 nights. We were going to tell the government that we will adopt all the orphans. We've got a center in Rishikesh, they can come live with us, or we'll build an orphanage down there, whatever the government wants. And we were going to conduct a yagna ceremony, a beautiful fire ceremony for all of those who had lost loved ones. You've made me very aware to not use the word lost and about the loved one, but all of those of whose loved ones had been tragically and horrendously taken by the waves. We get down there, we see the situation, people are sitting on rubble, staring out into the ocean, and we realize these people need a lot more than an orphanage and a fire ceremony. And so we ended up staying down for a long time. I won't go into the details of the work, but we ended up doing a lot of disaster relief work. We realized the first thing they need is houses. The houses have all been destroyed. These women, it was mostly men who were killed. They were out in the ocean. The women are sitting on the rubble of their homes. Classic PTSD cases, like they haven't budged in 72 hours, staring at the ocean in disbelief at what happened. Nobody's eaten, nobody's bathed. And we realized we've got to build houses. So we're on this big plot of land talking to the local district collector who's in charge. And he says, well, you know, the land policy hasn't all been worked out yet. We say, we don't care, we'll build temporary houses. Is this your land? Like, is this field we're standing in government land? He says, yes. We say, great, we'll build the temporary houses here. These people need a place to go inside, to sleep, to cook, to live. So he calls in a government contractor. We're doing all of this through a translator, and the government contractor is saying, I can put 75 houses here. And we push him to say 100, and I can do it in a week. We push him to say within 3 days. He says, but I'm going to need 50% payment up front. Now in Rishikesh, we're really well known. Nobody's going to make you pay 50% up front. They know who we are. They know we're not going anywhere. But here we are in this little town in South India. We don't have money, the ATMs aren't working, there's just been this enormous tsunami. We can't even get money wired quickly enough. My guru is standing there talking to the contractor. He says, yes, yes, by evening you will have it. I've got the equivalent of like $30 in my purse. I turn to the others with me, and collectively we've got, I don't know, $150 or something. And this guy's talking in the many, many, like tens of thousands of dollars we're gonna need by evening. So I try to say something like, don't commit too quickly. And he keeps committing. Okay. Later that afternoon, we're sitting in our makeshift office, tin shed on the hot sand. And from the distance, I see this car come. And you can see it because everything's been covered with sand since the tsunami. It just covered everything with feet of sand. So any car that comes, these huge mountains of sand go up. And the car stops right by where we are. And out of it comes this kind of overdressed for the heat of South India couple. And the gentleman is a Sikh, and I can see his turban from far away. And as they come closer, I recognize them as close devotees of the ashram. And I'm like, what are you doing here, and how did you find us? And he said, well, you know, when you're here, I mean, we just have to ask. Everybody's seen you. Everybody knows who you all are. We also had this Bollywood actor with us. So together we were this very well-known group. And he said, I just had to ask. Found you. We sit him down. And he says, oh, before I forget. And he reaches into his handbag and he hands me an envelope. And it's folded and stapled. And he hands me an envelope and he says, we were on our way to Rishikesh to the ashram to celebrate New Year's. And I was going to make this donation at the ashram, but when I found out that you were all here, we thought, okay, well, let us come and celebrate New Year's with you. And let me make this donation to the work that you're doing. To the rupee. It was exactly what we had to give the contractor that night. Like, I didn't have to open the envelope. We simply had to take the envelope and hand it to the contractor that night. So when you speak about grace, there's the experience of grace as the presence of the divine, and grace flowing through you, and grace running your life every minute, every moment. And then there's these experiences that are, I think of sometimes as sort of grace reminding you that she exists. You know, lest you forget that there is this power. We get these miracles sometimes to just remind us. So those are the ways for me today that grace just keeps showing up every minute. Sometimes just in the internal experience, and sometimes in these kind of crazy miracles.
It's a very eloquent story, so I have very little to add. When I thought of grace, it's sort of, it's like that when you live through things you think you can't survive, when people go through things that seem impossible to bear, we can very often. There's a resilience and sometimes joy that emerges after you least expect it. And it's nothing you can make happen. It's like that. I mean, that's just like something is given. And that's what I think the Greek word means divine gift. Charis.
What a lovely note to close on. And I know I speak for others in saying thank you both for giving us such a precious gift of your time, of your honesty, and of your wisdom. Please let's show our appreciation once again for
Thank you.
this beautiful conversation. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. This is, I have to confess, I'm very moved, not only by the words that were spoken, but also this is the first in-person gathering that we're hosting with guest speakers since early March of 2020, before, of course, the world drastically changed for all of us. And so there's a lot of emotions there, and I'm just very, very grateful that you all have shared with us your presence, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually, being present here, gathered here together as we navigate this all together and we look out for grace together. So we thank you all. If anyone would like, we do have books available for purchase, courtesy of Labyrinth Books, and I really want to encourage you. I feel like I don't need to do much of a pitch because you've already heard, you've already gotten glimpses of just how powerful these two books are, but they are available there. And Sadhviji and Elaine are kind enough to sign copies if you'd like. So I want to encourage you all to do that. Please do stay connected with us. You can follow us on social media, on Instagram and Facebook. You can also follow us on our website, hindu.princeton.edu. And please do look out for future events in person and virtual. Once again, on behalf of the Office of Religious Life and the Hindu Life Program, we're just so, so grateful. Thank you. Thank you all so much.